What's up, fellas? We're going to do some lifting tutorials today. We're going to start with the bench press, and we'll probably break these up into multiple videos so you can look for those other ones here on the channel as well. But we're going to start with the bench. What we have done so far before you ever get started is just set up. So having these J-cups, so that's this apparatus hanging on the bar here that holds the bar. So J-cup. Having those at the right height is an important factor. Alex is obviously taller than me. He's got a longer reach. He might end up needing, a taller setup than me. And if I come in here and the J-cups are where I literally can't get the bar off, stop and reset that stuff before you ever get started. One thing I've noticed is people will, in the first couple sets, like everything's really light. And so if you can overextend and get the bar off, they just go for it. But as soon as the weight gets heavy and you're trying to get the bar re-racked at the end of a heavy set, things can get pretty sketchy pretty quick, and you definitely don't want to drop a barbell on your face. So
definitely not. Take the time up front to get it working correctly, and then it will pay dividends on the back end.
Amen. So setup. Another thing I see guys do quite a bit is when they put the bench underneath the bar, they tend to go too far back, and then you start with your head way behind the bar, and now you don't have anywhere to go. So you're out in front of you, like way too far the entire time. The bar is down too close to your hips. You want the bar to start essentially right behind your head, or kind of right above where the bill of your cap would be.
Yes.
Like right in here is where I like to be.
Yeah. The cue that I've always used is you want to be looking directly at the bar, directly under the bar with your eyes, and then you can bring it off.
Right. The next thing that we'll cover, so you're coming from here to there, and now we've got plenty of room. And I don't know how far into the depth of this movement we'll get, but when you start to get to the point where you're driving with your hips through a movement and you're driving up and through, you can get more force going up and back than you can, well, I don't know if you can actually generate more force, but you end up going that direction on the flat bench. And so that's a good thing. You want to be moving up and back with the weight. That way you're moving up and back towards the rack.
Yes.
So that's kind of the setup. I'll walk through what I like to do when I sit down. I will typically sit down on the bench, get super squared up, make sure everything's even, make sure the bar is not way off to one side like this, get the bar centered. And then I will get my hands where I want them on the bar before setting my shoulders. And that is typically the first thing that I do when I lay down. That's, I think, something that people don't really pay attention to a lot of the time when they're starting out with the bench press is your setup and how important your back positioning is on the bench. So how do you work through that? Is it a particular rhythm that you have?
Yeah. So I always start to set my back before I even lay down. So I'll be sitting here on the bench, and I will consciously contract my lats, get myself a pretty stable spot to be pressing from. And then, so my back is not maximally contracted, but it's tight the entire way down. And then I'll grab the bar, make sure it's even, get it approximately where I want, get my hands set, and we can talk about hand width and position in a minute here. And I'll get set here, and then my back is already in a good stable position to press from. And from there, I'll unrack the bar.
Mm-hmm. I'm very similar. I won't necessarily start contracting beforehand. I will kind of move through that motion though.
Yes.
Like kind of moving through, like getting everything set. I guess I do that now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
You're kind of getting everything set. I'll lay back, get my hands there, and I'll set. The one thing we haven't talked about yet is your feet. So a lot of time people's like legs are just kind of limp and just like sitting on the ground. They might be super wide or something. So I like to get some tension. I always talk about getting tension basically like from my shoulders to my kneecaps.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll get my hands set, get my back set, press my back into the bench. And then you notice like my toes came back. I try to get my toes as close to being under my hips as possible and almost kind of think about locking my feet into the ground. And so there's a ton of tension all the way from the top of my shoulders through my quads, through my core, all the way into my knees, basically, before unracking the bar. And then everything's super tight. There's not a bunch of wiggling going on, and everything's super rigid going into the movement.
Yes.
Similar for you.
Very, very similar. My feet probably don't go quite as far back under, but that's a pretty individual thing too. The principle that we want to work from is having a stable base to press off of, and then you have a couple routes you can go. Some guys really like to have their feet back under them. Some guys like to really have their feet out and have their whole foot flat on the floor. I kind of am in the middle ground there, but definitely compared to what Tate was showing, more so, my feet will be out a little further. I'll try and get more of my foot on the floor, to root into the ground and press through.
Very nice. So that's the setup. That's all just working up to the movement. Like we haven't actually even started the movement yet. That's all just setup stuff. But what you're saying there, having a good base to press from, this is very similar to the principle of almost anything else. If the foundation's shaky, things are probably not going to all of a sudden get better in the middle of the movement. It's probably going to continue to degrade as you go. So setup is super important, getting everything stable and ready to go.
Yeah.
From there, I like to think about driving my elbows or pulling my elbows, almost like I'm doing a row. Pulling my elbows and my thumbs to my armpits. I don't know if not everyone does this, and you mentioned hand position. I tend to be pretty narrow with my bench press.
Yes.
It just feels more comfortable. I feel less at risk in that position. The wider I go, the more my chest opens, the more my shoulders have to handle. It doesn't feel as safe, I guess.
Yeah, I think it also, it's a better position to press from stability wise. And then it's also just generally more applicable to what you're going to find yourself doing on a daily basis. You're not,
right.
Most of the stuff you're doing is going to be in fairly close to your frame. If you look at it from like an athletic standpoint, as a front seven defensive player in football, everything.
Yeah, or an offensive lineman.
Offensive lineman, something like, everything's going to be sort of inside the frame. That's just a good, general spot to press from. If you are watching this as someone who wants to compete in the sport of powerlifting or who is looking to step on a bodybuilding stage, I'm not telling you that this is the only way to do it or that this would be the best way for you to do it in your specific case. But talking about guys who want to get generally strong and fit, I recommend something akin to a shoulder width grip. A little more, a little less. You'll find what's comfortable. A little different for everybody. Agreed. The trick that I use is I will take this joint, this crease in my thumb, and I'll put that on the edge of the knurling of most standard barbells. Lines up pretty well. And that gets me right to where I want to be. And then I can press from there.
I'm very, very similar. I'm pretty close grip. And this is something we hadn't even talked about before, but I'm pretty close grip as well. Yeah. I just think it's more applicable, like you said, to everyday life. You would never see someone walk up and they need to push on something really hard and then they do this. No one does that. You walk up and you get stuff right in front of your shoulders and then you push. So you might as well train the same way. Especially for us, I think in this group, the idea is to be at a higher level of physical capacity in the world for your life.
Yeah.
I think this is the best way to do that. It's not to say that the other ways are wrong or anything. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes people press more weight from a wider grip because it's not as far of a distance for the weight to travel, but I just like a narrower grip. So let's kind of run through what that would look like. Like Alex said, you're kind of thinking about setting your shoulders, and we say that as if everybody knows what we're talking about, but essentially I'm thinking about pulling my
shoulder blades down.
Shoulder blades down and back and setting them in a position. If you were going to pretend that you were an action figure for a second and you were like standing like Superman.
Very much so. Yeah.
Pretty much that position, that like shoulders down and back, big chest. And then, I'll lay back, get my hands set, get my feet set and locked in. And then shoulders down and back. I try to pinch my shoulder blades together and get as much of my back onto the bench as possible. That's something I consciously think about. I try not to let things be hanging off of the bench. I try to get as much of my back on the bench as possible. I'll reach up. And then when I grip the bar, I'm thinking about twisting my hand externally. So I'm driving my thumb and my pinky into the bar and locking my hand in place. I'll unrack the bar, and then I'm pulling my thumbs to my armpits, basically. Here. Just like that.
Yep. Very similar setup on my end.
Yep. So when you get to the bottom of that press, I don't know if you noticed, but I'll pick my head up as the bar is coming down. So I'm thinking about this not being an isolation movement, really. I don't want it to just be my chest and triceps. I want to involve as much of my body musculature in the movement as possible. So I'm thinking about pulling the bar into me and then everything exploding and coming out. So like a full pull and curl in and then driving back the other way, which will involve a lot more of your back, more of your legs, and you can tend to move more weight that way. It's more efficient as well. Yes. Loading the bar. Something that you may not be thinking about if you're going into this for the first time, but maybe it's the first time you're walking into a gym. Having a 45-pound offset on one side is generally about as much of an offset as you want.
Load them evenly. So load a side, corresponding weight on the other side, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth.
Exactly.
As high as you're going to go.
Yep.
The rack and the bar can support a lot of weight, but it has to be fairly evenly distributed. Otherwise, you're in for a bad time.
Yeah.
Don't ask us how we know.
Yeah. If I had taken this 45 and put it on that side, this bar is flipping that way, pretty quickly. So yeah, load the bar evenly. This is 135.
Yeah. 135 on a bar. And it's easy to just kind of talk through things theoretically for you to see how things go, with no load. But when you're loading things, you'll be actually training this, not just talking about it. So it'd be helpful to see what this looks like with some level of actual resistance. So like Tate said, kind of getting yourself a good setup. I'm going to kind of bring my shoulders down and back, get my back fairly tight, come down here, get as much of my back on the bench as I can, create tension throughout my whole body, from my shoulders where they're rooting into the bench, through my butt where that's on the bench, and then in through my legs as well. Find my hand position that I want, get a solid grip there, and then unrack the bar. My shoulders are never going to come out of this unpacked position. So unrack the bar, bring your elbows down to your armpits, your thumbs down to your armpits. The wrists should stay pretty much directly over the elbows. You shouldn't get yourself into a spot where they're tracking out of line drastically with each other.
Right. Just like that. Something I think about a lot of the time, especially getting into this, if you're not used to moving a decent amount of weight in a press like this. This goes for the bench press or the strict press. Having a semi-locked wrist is really helpful. If you go into this and it's the very first time you're going to move a certain amount of weight and your wrist is completely broken over and sitting back and the weight is sitting basically like in your knuckles rather than over your wrist, it just makes everything so much more difficult. It seems like people don't often think about the amount of energy that's wasted in their wrist moving in something like a press. There's every time you are putting energy into your hand and then it stays in your hand instead of going into the bar, things get more difficult. You want as much energy translation as possible from your chest and shoulders, these big muscle groups, through your hand and wrist coming up through. So your grip actually does matter in the bench press.
Yes.
This is 185.
Yep. Just the next progression. And this goes beyond the bench press to any movement that you're going to load. Preferably you would not just walk in cold and do your heaviest set of the day. You're going to start generally with an empty bar and then pyramid your way up slowly. The stronger you get, the bigger the gaps might be. If you're just starting out, an empty bar, a 5 or a 10, and then just keep pyramiding that way is fine. But the principle that we want to look at here is you don't want to just go from zero to your max effort with no warm up.
Start slow, work your way up is a good principle for pretty much anything. And that's the macro or the micro. on a daily basis with one particular lift, and over time as you're trying to get stronger as well. Start slow, build up. Got his shoulder blades pinched. Hands stay right above his elbow joints, driving the weight straight up and through. I will have a little bit of chest bounce in mine, not a tremendous amount. I think if you're wanting to train for like maximal loads, having a bit of a pause at the bottom can be advantageous, especially with lighter weight, to just learn to control the weight a little bit more. So more along those lines.
Yeah.
Like receiving the weight, controlling it, then pressing up and through.
All right. Now we're at 225 pounds on the bar. Weight is steadily progressing, but regardless, the setup will remain the same, and that should be the same from your first warm-up set through to your last set of the day.
It's a really good point. Don't start your sets at lighter weights doing something totally different than you're going to do at your heavier stuff. Maintain the same form throughout the entire progression of the movement.
Feet firmly rooted into the ground. They're not as far back as Tate's setup, which is fine. It's an individual thing, but regardless, they're going to be rooted in the ground pretty good. And we're going to unrack.
Very good. Another thing that you'll notice, he stopped talking whenever he was about to unrack the bar. And the reason for that is because he's taking a big breath and bracing. So he's taking a big breath in and then squeezing with his entire diaphragm down through his rib cage. And there's tension, like we talked about earlier, from his shoulders all the way through his knees that he is holding tight in place, because the only thing that he wants moving is this bar.
Yes.
You don't want the weight moving you. You want to move the weight. And one of the ways that you do that is by something that a guy wrote an article on a long time ago, the Kabuki strength guy.
Yeah, Chris Duffin.
Chris Duffin wrote an article on this a long time ago called Anaconda Strength. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to be able to contract as much of the musculature in the body as possible through a giant breath in, a ton of bracing, and then squeezing through your core in any lift, but especially the big compound lifts.
Yes. Like
the bench, the squat, and the deadlift. I'll do a few reps here as well, just so you can see a little bit different setup. But a lot of the mechanics are going to be very much the same. Just like that. All right, guys. That's the bench press. We're going to move on to some other tutorials, so look out for those. Like I said earlier, we're probably going to do some deadlifting next, and then we'll do a squat video as well. So if you got any more questions about this, say you saw something in particular and you're like, all right, that one little nuanced thing, what's going on right there? Be sure to ask us. You guys are the only ones getting access to these videos here in the Brotherhood. So these are for you guys in particular. Ask any questions that you have, and we will get back to you.